And the topic for the update this year was how Jokowi has changed Indonesia. So can you give us a bit of a sense of what was the discussion, what were the themes that came out about Jokowi's legacy, and how will we come back to look on the decade of Jokowi's presidency?
Yeah, sure.
Welcome to the Lowy Institute. My name is Susanna Patton and I'm Director of the Southeast Asia program here. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land we meet on today, and I would like to pay my respects to all elders past and present. Well, today it is my great honour to moderate a stellar panel on Indonesia for this event, which we are hosting in collaboration with the ANU Indonesia Update Conference, which has just wrapped up in Canberra. I'm not sure when the last time was that we hosted such firepower on Indonesia here at 31 Bligh Street as we have with us today. So I'm really delighted to introduce briefly our panellists who will be in conversation with me on Jokowi's legacy and the political transition which is currently underway in Indonesia. So to my right, we have Eve Warburton. She's a co-convener of the Indonesia Update this year and a senior lecturer in the Department of Political and Social Change in the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs at ANU. Then we have Rizal Sukma. He is a senior fellow and former director of CSIS Indonesia and a former ambassador of Indonesia to the United Kingdom. Sydney Jones is a senior advisor to the Institute for Policy Analysis of Conflict, or IPAC, in Jakarta, which she founded, and a very long-standing observer of politics and conflict in Indonesia. And finally, Marcus Mietzner, an associate professor also with the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs and currently writing a book on the Jokowi presidency. So we're in really great hands today. So I think I'll start out by asking you, Eve. So together with Sana Jaffrey, you were a convener of the conference this year, which is the biggest conference on Indonesia outside Indonesia and very long running as well. And the topic for the update this year was how Jokowi has changed Indonesia. So can you give us a bit of a sense of what was the discussion, what were the themes that came out about Jokowi's legacy, and how will we come back to look on the decade of Jokowi's presidency?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Susanna, and thanks very much to Lowy for the opportunity to speak today. So we held this conference at ANU Friday and Saturday, and we brought together speakers and experts from all around the world to address this question. So what kind of president was Jokowi? What sort of legacy did he seek to leave behind? What did he achieve? And what sort of polity is Prabowo, president-elect? What is he inheriting? And we sort of covered a lot of ground. We looked at economic arenas and political arenas, and I think if I can kind of summarise very crudely what many of our excellent presenters on the economy sort of found, I think they characterised a sort of mixed picture. So he's a president that really set out to achieve a lot in terms of infrastructure. He wanted to build physical things, and he did a relatively good job, I think, on that front, according to our experts. He expanded the sort of welfare programs that SBY, or President Yudhoyono before him, had sort of set up. He expanded them. He brought poverty down at a sort of similar rate, I'd say, to SBY. So he achieved quite a lot in that sort of space. The picture was much more mixed, I think, when economists looked into his legacy in terms of not just he increased FDI, but the quality of FDI that he leaves behind. The manufacturing sector in Indonesia has continued to decline in terms of its contribution to GDP. The middle class is a little bit smaller. And so there are kind of significant areas in terms of the economy where Jokowi didn't achieve what he set out to. But some areas where he indeed, I think, hit the mark. He really wanted to be Indonesia's infrastructure president, and that's how he was referred to on and off throughout the conference. So a mixed picture. But when it comes to the politics, to the political institutions that Jokowi leaves behind, the picture was far less mixed, and I would say there is a real, I think, consensus amongst analysts both within and outside of Indonesia that over the course of the last 10 years, Jokowi has left a relatively dark legacy for Indonesia's democracy, and that over this period he has, and the people who have allied with him, people in his coalition, have very systematically, in fact, hollowed out many of Indonesia's democratic institutions and institutions that are designed to check executive power, whether that be the Constitutional Court, the Corruption Eradication Commission, the Parliament as well. These are institutions that have really suffered under Jokowi and that have been over time, especially the last 5 years, been used for partisan purposes. But what a paper that I gave on Friday with my colleague Sana Jaffrey looked really just at the last year of Jokowi's presidency and the political events of the last 12 months. And we wanted to make this point in our presentation, that over the last sort of 5 or 6 or 7 years, analysts have had this consensus that Indonesia's democracy is in decline, regression, it's backsliding. But analysts have also agreed that Indonesia's elections have remained strong, relatively free and fair, and most importantly, competitive. However, this year in 2024, what we argued was that that is no longer the case, and that the presidential elections in Indonesia, we saw a lot of state intervention. We saw the use of the Constitutional Court by the president to create a loophole that would allow his son to run as the vice president on Prabowo's ticket. And we saw a lot of kind of uses of incumbent power across a range of institutions, particularly the police, being used to kind of drum up support for Jokowi's son and for Prabowo Subianto. And that really changed the playing field. It really tilted the playing field in favour of Prabowo and Gibran. And we count that as actually a real moment of democratic regression for Indonesia. We also looked at the upcoming regional elections, and we pointed to the gubernatorial election in Jakarta as another example of where competitive elections have really become under attack in the last 12 months. Anies Baswedan, a very, very popular candidate for the gubernatorial elections in Jakarta, is no longer able to run, and we really emphasised that the reason he's no longer able to run is because he couldn't get enough support from political parties. And never really has it been the case in Indonesia that a popular candidate can't get support from parties. And the reason he couldn't get support is because the incumbent government, Jokowi and Prabowo, see Anies Baswedan as a threat. And so they went around trying to convince these parties through coercion and through inducements and promises of ministries and things like this, a kind of combination of cash and coercion to peel those parties away from him. So Jokowi leaves office, in fact, after 10 years of democratic decline. And the last year in particular, we've seen a real regression in the quality of Indonesia's electoral landscape as well, and the degree of competitiveness of Indonesia's elections. So that's the kind of picture that really emerged over the last few days, a president who really focused on particular aspects of the economy, infrastructure and welfare, and achieved quite a lot in that regard. But at the same time, he has very explicitly and with intention kind of eroded very key and important and fundamental features of Indonesia's democracy at the same time.
Thank you so much for that. So maybe Pak Rizal, to you, how do you think we'll come back to look on Jokowi's decade in power? What are the defining features to you of his time in office?
Okay, thank you. It's great to be back at Lowy. Probably I will look at very specifically on foreign policy, sure. Because this is the task that Eve gave me back in Canberra a couple of days ago. I've been thinking very hard to answer any question about Jokowi's legacy in foreign policy. And then only recently I come up with at least 3. Number 1, I think he leaves behind a foreign policy that can really deliver real benefit to the real people. So because foreign policy has been perceived as a very high up issues that nobody really get to know exactly how it benefit the country and the people. That means the consular services, citizen services has been improving tremendously across the globe in every embassies of Indonesia. That was the first instructions that I got when we became an ambassador, that improve the consular services and citizen protections. Number 2, he leaves behind a foreign policy that really focused on economic diplomacy. To be fair, I think this is one of the neglected area of diplomacy, so far under Yudhoyono and also under other president. This, I think, is quite important. We need to improve this, but the key challenge is really that is not the only aspect of foreign policy. We need also, I think, to cover and also focus on other issues. The final one is not really legacy, but probably lessons. If you look at the history of Indonesia's foreign relation, Indonesia's foreign policy, and also other, in domestic politics, economic policy over the last 10 years, it really convinced me that Indonesia is a country that always tries to change in order to stay the same. So that's.
Well, can you explain that?
Well, I mean, in politics, we started with democratization. We want to change, and finally now, I think it's also we feel it also in foreign policy, then the perception of democratic decline, the debate on this particular issue, and then some issues that become very familiar. The more we change, the more familiar you become with Indonesia. So that's the lesson. Not really legacy, because we don't think that should be the legacy, but that's the lessons. So a lot of things Marcus will tell you later, and how it stay the same, even though I think we tried to change in 1998. So the update really demonstrated as well. The Indonesia update that we just had in Canberra really demonstrated that. A lot of things that we have changed now is slowly coming back, to the original form when we began to democratize back in 1998. Hopefully somebody can really break this kind of pattern, and then really change for the real change. So hopefully. But hope is not, of course, policy, right?
Sydney, what's your high-level reflection on Jokowi's legacy?
Well, he's leaving behind a much more politicized set of security forces. So we're seeing a police that has become, in a way, an extension of presidential power. He came into office not knowing very much, not being very experienced in security affairs, certainly not being comfortable with that. And he gradually moved to a point where he put cronies in top military and police positions, people who had overlapped with him when he was mayor of Solo, so that their major qualities were loyalty to him. Their major credential for office was loyalty to the president, not anything else. And this translated into Jokowi's being comfortable with the people at the top of these institutions. It led to his feeling comfortable using the police to basically go after his own enemies, particularly during elections, where he would basically have the police threaten to arrest people on corruption charges at a village level, at a local official level, unless they dropped their support for a candidate that wasn't Prabowo. And we saw how he would use police intelligence, or the police would use their own intelligence services to figure out who was supporting other candidates and then go and intimidate those individuals either to being silent or to supporting the Prabowo ticket. In the military, it was somewhat different because he couldn't use them in the same way, but under Jokowi, the military became far more involved in non-military matters. So we saw the expansion of the military into everything from agricultural extension to, in some cases, working as security guards in terminals and harbors and things like that through memorandums of understanding, MOUs that he would sign, that the military would sign with different line ministries. And in the course of this, I think, the military is extending its own reach into civilian matters in a way that challenges the police. One of their institutional objectives was to claw back powers that had been given to the police in internal security in 1999, when the police were separated from the military. And it's just been a constant pattern thereafter of the military strengthening the territorial command structure and moving into areas that are called military operations other than war. The one other thing I would say on this is that Jokowi leaves behind a Papua that is far more violent than it was when he came into office. And despite his commitment when he took office to addressing Papua and being interested in that, he has left a situation where, if anything, grievances have intensified and the violence is worse than when he came in.
Thank you. So, Marcus, maybe we can deep dive a little bit on the politics and also on what that politics means for the democratic erosion, which both Eve and Sydney have touched on already. So we saw for this presidential election an alliance formed between Jokowi and Prabowo, which in some ways seemed a kind of unlikely alliance, but is potentially a way that Jokowi saw that he could perpetuate his power and his legacy. Are you able to talk us through that dynamic and how you think that that could unfold in the term ahead?
Yeah, so the first thing to remember is that Prabowo was not his first choice. He tried several other things before he settled on Prabowo. In fact, the first thing he tried was getting his own term extended, and that failed. When that failed, he said, okay, how about a 3-year extension? That failed as well. He then, for a period of time, considered Ganjar Pranowo, the governor of Central Java at the time, as his preferred heir. That fell through because he came to the conclusion that he would be more willing to listen to Megawati Sukarno Putri's instructions rather than his. So Megawati, the former president, and the head of the party that Jokowi was a member of for the majority of his presidency. After Ganjar, he basically ran out of options. There would have been only one other candidate who would have had the necessary popularity to run in an election. That was Anies Baswedan. He hates Anies Baswedan, so that was also not an option. So that left him with Prabowo. Then, of course, Prabowo also understood how he needed to play this, and he came up then with the idea, of course, knowing that Jokowi would respond well to this, to take his son Gibran as his vice presidential candidate. So these are the constellations. This was not a love marriage. This was a very much a marriage of convenience. Now, as political scientists, we look at this through a political economy lens, and if you have a constellation such as this, a former president who puts in a successor, their interests eventually will not only diverge, but in fact become contradictory. So as we look forward to the 20th of October, when the transfer of power happens, it's inevitable for really the contradictory interests to emerge. Prabowo will have the interest of becoming as popular as Jokowi was, to look towards 2029 as the next election, to build up a case for his re-election then. Jokowi will have an interest that not Prabowo gets popular, but his son gets popular. At some point then will be able to challenge for the presidency himself. So and that means that Prabowo will have an interest to run programs that are very popular in his own name, travel the country and tell everyone what a great job he's doing, while Gibran, the son of Jokowi, has the same interest, and eventually this will clash. There's also all kinds of policy differences. The new capital, for instance, which is sort of the pet project of Jokowi, but Prabowo couldn't care less about it. And of course, there we'll have to see how much money is still being spent on that. So for us, it's relatively clear that what we're looking at is a slow, gradual, but unmistakably, grave falling out between the two at some point. I don't think it will be as serious and visible like in the Philippines. It will all be sort of a little bit more gentle, but eventually these interests will, not only diverge, but be contradictory.
And I guess we've already seen that starting to happen a little bit with Jokowi's efforts to rewrite some of the rules around local elections. Eve, would you like to speak to that and the sort of dynamic that we've seen and how we should understand what's happened over the last couple of months?
Sure. I'm not sure how informed the audience is about the sort of recent events in Indonesia, but for anyone who was following the news, you may have seen that just in recent weeks there was a sort of an outpouring of popular protest onto the streets in Indonesia, not just in Jakarta, but in other parts of the country as well. These protests weren't as big as some of the other protests we've seen during the Jokowi era back in sort of 2019, 2020, but they were big enough, and they were there to defend the Constitutional Court, and it was a decision the court had made that would essentially, in a nutshell, have opened up more competitiveness at the local level. It would have allowed smaller political parties to nominate regional heads. And it also would have upheld, would have ensured, in fact, that, this is very complicated, but it would have disallowed Jokowi's younger son to run as a vice gubernatorial candidate in Central Java. So it had two really important consequences for the upcoming Pilkada, and those consequences were actually very negative for Jokowi. It would have, ruined another part of his plan to build a dynasty, and it also had consequences for coalitional politics that would have had a negative impact on Jokowi and Prabowo, it seemed. So the parliament, sort of on direction of Jokowi and the incumbent coalition, immediately goes to write a law that would basically ignored the Constitutional Court's decision. So people go out onto the streets and they protest and they defend the Constitutional Court. And lo and behold, for the first time, actually, during the Jokowi period, the protesters seem to get their way. And the DPR, the parliament, backs down and the Constitutional Court's ruling is upheld. And indeed, we now have a more competitive set of regional elections where small parties can nominate regional heads, and Kaisan, Jokowi's son, cannot run in the Central Java election. But I think what we discussed in some detail during the conference, and what's really important to understand about these protests, as important as they were, is that the agenda of the protesters, in fact, coalesced with the interests of Prabowo. And Prabowo had a real hand to play here in ensuring, in ordering the DPR, in ordering the political parties to back down. This was where we saw a line drawn where Prabowo said, okay, I've allowed Gibran, I've invited Gibran, and I benefited from having Gibran on my ticket and helping and giving Jokowi this sort of access to power in his post-presidential period. But what he wasn't going to stand for was more dynasty building. And so it was not in his interests to open it to oppose or to undo this Constitutional Court ruling. In fact, it was in his interest to uphold it in that sense. We also understood that what Prabowo didn't want was to start his presidency on the back of popular protest, and that he was concerned because people were surprised, in fact, some of the elite were surprised at the degree to which there was a public backlash here. There'd been no public backlash when the Constitutional Court, the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court, is Jokowi's brother-in-law, and when that Constitutional Court created that loophole that allowed Gibran to run as vice president, there was in fact no public backlash. So this wasn't predicted, but people did go out into the streets. Some very high-profile activists and political pollsters and analysts went down into the streets, and it really unsettled, I think, Prabowo, and it was unclear how big the protests would get. So there were elite interests here that converged with popular protest. And it also demonstrated, to your point, Susanna, that we had a diverging interest between Jokowi and Prabowo. And Prabowo called it and sided with the protesters and defended his own interests. And that's, I think, when we first sort of started to see these cracks appear. But Marcus or Sydney or Rizal might have some other.
I think one of the things to add to that is despite this success, in fact, the space for civil society has also declined under Jokowi. And we have seen political space for freedom of expression narrowing. There are two bills now before the parliament, one on the police and one on the military, which have also been the target of protests because, among other things, the police bill would increase monitoring of social media and increase the powers of the police to block or shut down the internet. And we have seen dissidents and critics, particularly during the COVID period, be the targets of police investigation because of their criticism